The room went quiet the moment the county engineer put the number on the screen. $620,417. That was the estimated cost of replacing a bridge that technically didn't belong to the people who had been using it every day for almost a year. Across the hearing room, Miranda Elise Norwood sat perfectly still with her hands folded on the table, wearing the same confident smile she'd brought to every HOA meeting. Then the engineer clicked to the next slide. Aerial photographs filled the screen. Parcel lines appeared in bright red. My bridge sat right in the middle of land that had belonged to my family since Harry Truman was in the White House. Nobody said a word, not even Miranda. The funny thing is, none of this started with a lawsuit. It started with a pickup truck. About 14 months earlier, I was standing near the west pasture of Holloway Ridge Ranch just after sunrise when I spotted a landscaping truck crossing my bridge. At first I thought it was lost. Then another truck crossed. Then a golf cart. Then a delivery van. By noon I counted 17 vehicles. That was a problem. The bridge wasn't county property. It wasn't public access. It wasn't HOA property. My grandfather built it with his own hands more than 70 years ago, and every board, bolt, repair bill, and inspection record belonged to the Holloway family. So before anybody says I sat around and let it happen, let me tell you exactly what I did that first day. I called the sheriff's office. I called the county property records department. Then I pulled the original deed file and parcel map from my office safe. 3 calls. One afternoon. No drama. The deputy who arrived was professional about it. He looked at the bridge, looked at the vehicles, took notes, and told me something that frustrated me but wasn't unusual. Since nobody was threatening anyone and there was a dispute over access rights, the sheriff considered it a civil property matter unless a court order already existed. That didn't mean the drivers were right. It just meant he couldn't settle ownership standing beside a creek. Fair enough. So I moved to step 2. Before sunset I installed 2 trail cameras overlooking both ends of the bridge. I photographed every vehicle. I logged license plates. I emailed a local property attorney named Aaron Talbot and requested a formal review of the title history. Then I ordered certified copies of every recorded document attached to the parcel. Paper beats noise. The next morning I posted signs at both approaches to the bridge. Private bridge. No unauthorized access. Owner permission required. I also added a weight limit sign because the bridge had been designed for ranch traffic, not constant neighborhood use. By lunch, one of the signs had disappeared. By evening, both were gone. That's when I realized this wasn't confusion anymore. Somebody wanted people crossing that bridge. A few days later I found out who. Miranda Norwood had recently become president of Cedar Creek Estates, the subdivision bordering part of my ranch. At a community meeting, she described my bridge as a shared neighborhood connector. She called it beneficial infrastructure. She called it practical access. She called it a community asset. She never called it what it actually was. Private property. And somehow that distinction was getting lost. What bothered me most wasn't the traffic. It was the certainty. Miranda spoke like ownership was a suggestion and repetition could somehow replace paperwork. Every time another vehicle crossed that bridge after a warning sign disappeared, my cameras recorded it. Every email got saved. Every conversation got documented. I wasn't building an argument. I was building a file. Because here's something my father taught me when I was a kid standing on that same bridge watching the creek run beneath us. If somebody wants what belongs to you, don't be the loudest person in the room. Be the one holding the records. And before I tell you what showed up inside the HOA's own email archive months later, I'm curious where you're listening from tonight, because folks who have dealt with land disputes, easement fights, or HOA headaches usually recognize the warning signs long before everyone else does. A week after I started pulling records, my dining room table disappeared under stacks of paper. Certified deeds, parcel maps, survey drawings, tax records. The kind of documents most people never look at until something goes wrong. I spent 3 evenings going through every page because I wanted to know exactly what belonged to my family and exactly what did not. Details matter. The first document was the easiest to understand. It was the original deed transferring the ranch from my grandfather, Samuel Holloway, to my father in 1978. Later, another recorded deed transferred the property to me after Dad passed away. The legal description was boring to read, but it was crystal clear. The bridge sat entirely inside Parcel 17B of Holloway Ridge Ranch. Not half, not part, all of it. The county records matched perfectly. That mattered. The parcel map told the same story. Bright boundary lines showed every acre of the ranch, every fence line, every creek crossing, and every easement recorded over the last 70 years. When I laid the map beside the survey report, the bridge was nowhere near a public road easement. It was not inside county right-of-way. It was not shared infrastructure. It was private property from one end to the other. No gray area. That is when Erin Talbot called me. She had already reviewed the title history. Weston, she said, the ownership side is easy. Your family owns the bridge. The more important question is whether somebody else has a legal right to cross it. That was exactly what I needed answered. Because ownership and access are not the same thing. A lot of people mix those up. Erin explained it in plain English. A deed tells you who owns something. An easement tells you who may use part of that property for a specific purpose. Those are two different things. If I let my neighbor use my driveway to reach his barn, that does not mean he owns my driveway. It means he has permission to use it under specific conditions. Simple. So we started searching for easements. We found several on the ranch. An old utility easement allowed a power company to maintain lines near the north pasture. Another allowed a water district to inspect equipment once a year near the creek. Both were recorded properly. Both had limits. Neither mentioned the bridge. More importantly, neither gave anyone authority to control, profit from, or manage my property. That is where things started getting interesting. Because while searching older records, Erin found a document Miranda seemed to be relying on during HOA meetings. It was not a deed. It was not an easement. It was not even a county-approved access agreement. It was a subdivision planning packet from years earlier showing a conceptual route connecting parts of the neighborhood. Conceptual, not legal, not recorded, not approved, just an idea on paper. Big difference. I remember staring at that page while rain tapped against the kitchen windows. Somebody had taken an old planning sketch and started talking about it, as if it created ownership rights. It did not. The next morning I drove out to the bridge before sunrise. Fog drifted above the creek, and water moved slowly beneath the wooden beams my grandfather built decades ago. The old planks creaked softly under my boots, exactly the same way they had when I was 10 years old walking beside Dad. Something stay with you. I ran my hand along the weathered railing and thought about all the years my family spent maintaining that crossing. Every repair invoice was in a file cabinet. Every inspection report was documented. Every board replaced after storms had been paid for by HOA money. Nobody from the HOA had ever contributed a dime. Not once. Then another delivery van rolled across the bridge. Then another. Then a landscaping trailer. My cameras recorded all of it. I watched from the creek bank as tire after tire rolled across a structure the drivers believed belonged to everyone. But paperwork was telling a very different story. And before long, I was about to learn that somebody inside the HOA had already been warned about exactly that. About 2 weeks after Erin found that planning packet, Cedar Creek Estates held its monthly HOA meeting. I did not attend. Instead, one of the homeowners I had known for years sent me a copy of the meeting summary the next morning. At first glance, it looked harmless. There were updates about landscaping, drainage maintenance, and a playground project. Then I reached a section titled Community Access Initiative. That got my attention. According to the summary, the board had voted on a resolution recognizing the bridge route as an essential neighborhood connector. The wording sounded official. That was the point. But a resolution is not a deed. It does not transfer ownership. It does not create an easement. It certainly does not give an HOA control over somebody else's property. Still, most people do not spend their evenings reading land records. They read emails. Miranda understood that. Over the next month, homeowners began receiving updates from the board explaining that the bridge provided a safer and more efficient route for deliveries, maintenance vehicles, and emergency access. She framed everything around convenience and safety. Parents were told school service vehicles could reach homes faster. Older residents were told medical access might improve. New homeowners were told property values benefited from better connectivity. It sounded reasonable. That was what made it effective. One afternoon, I stopped at a local hardware store and ran into a man named Kyle who lived inside Cedar Creek Estates. He looked uncomfortable the second he saw me. "Weston, I hope there is no bad blood," he said. Miranda told us the access issue was already settled. I asked him what that meant. He shrugged. She said the board approved it, and the route had been used long enough that nobody could really shut it down now. There it was. Not ownership, not law, momentum. People were being convinced that long-term use automatically created permanent rights. That is not how it works. Around the same time, something else started happening. Contractors began appearing more frequently. Lawn companies, utility crews, fence installers, pest control trucks. At first, I assumed they were simply following GPS directions. Then I started talking to them. One crew leader showed me an email from the HOA office. The message included a neighborhood access map with my bridge highlighted in yellow. Beneath it was a note instructing vendors to use the designated connector route whenever possible. I stared at the screen for a second. Then I asked, "Did anyone tell you this bridge is private property?" The contractor blinked. "No, sir. We were told this was HOA access." That changed the picture. The contractors were not trying to ignore ownership. They were relying on information provided by the HOA. I asked for a copy of the email. To my surprise, he sent it before leaving the ranch. Another piece of evidence landed in the file cabinet. By early summer, traffic counts from my cameras had doubled. Delivery trucks crossed in the morning. Service vehicles crossed in the afternoon. Residents drove across throughout the day. Every crossing generated another timestamp. Every timestamp built the record. Meanwhile, Miranda kept pushing the same message. During one neighborhood gathering, she reportedly stood in front of a large map and told residents, "We are protecting access for everyone. Nobody wants to wake up one morning and discover a vital route has disappeared." It was a smart argument because it appealed to fear. People do not like losing something they believe they already have, even when they never legally had it in the first place. Then came the moment that made me realize this was no longer a misunderstanding. One evening, a homeowner forwarded me an internal HOA email chain by mistake. I doubt it was intentional. I think he clicked the wrong address. But once I opened it, I found board members discussing complaints about the bridge signs disappearing. One director asked whether the signs should be respected until ownership questions were resolved. Miranda responded less than an hour later. Removing visual obstacles helps maintain community continuity and prevents confusion. I read that sentence 3 times. She was not denying the signs existed. She was not questioning ownership. She was talking about removing obstacles. The bridge was becoming central to a plan much larger than simple neighborhood convenience. And somewhere behind all those polished emails and carefully chosen words, there was a reason Miranda needed people crossing that bridge so badly. The accidental email kept bothering me because it changed the question I was asking. Up until then, I had been trying to figure out whether the HOA was mistaken. After reading Miranda's message about removing obstacles, I started asking whether somebody already knew they were wrong. That is a very different question. The next morning, I called Erin and told her I wanted to stop reacting and start building a complete record. She agreed immediately. "If this ends up in front of a county board or a judge," she said, "you do not win with opinions. You win with documents." That became the plan. First, I ordered a certified deed package directly from the county recorder. I already had copies, but certified records carry more weight because they come straight from the government archive. The package confirmed the ownership chain from my grandfather to my father and then to me. No gaps, no disputes, no transfers. That evidence had one job: prove exactly who owned the bridge. Simple. Second, Erin obtained a formal title report from a title company. Unlike a deed, a title report searches for claims, restrictions, easements, liens, and recorded rights connected to a property. We wanted somebody independent to check everything. 2 weeks later, the report arrived. It listed utility easements. It listed historical records. It listed boundary descriptions. What it did not list was even more important. There was no access easement benefiting Cedar Creek Estates. None. That evidence had a different job. It proved what rights did not exist. Sometimes absence is evidence. Third, I hired a licensed survey crew that had no connection to me, the county, or the HOA. They spent 2 days measuring boundaries with modern GPS equipment and comparing them to recorded maps. Bright orange flags appeared across sections of the ranch while technicians checked coordinates. A week later, they delivered a certified survey. The bridge sat completely inside my parcel boundaries. Not partially, completely. The survey would become important later because people can argue about opinions. They have a harder time arguing with measurements. Numbers do not care who is angry. Fourth came the engineering side. The increase in traffic was impossible to ignore. Every week, my cameras showed more vehicles crossing than the week before. I hired a structural engineer named Caleb Morris to inspect the bridge. He walked every beam, measured load points, photographed support members, and reviewed maintenance records dating back years. His report was detailed. The structure remained safe for ranch use, but it was never designed for constant neighborhood traffic, delivery fleets, contractor trucks, and service vehicles. More importantly, the report warned that continued heavy use could accelerate wear and increase future repair costs. That evidence had a specific purpose. It connected the unauthorized traffic to measurable risk. Then came the photographs. Thousands of them. My cameras recorded license plates, vehicle types, timestamps, and daily traffic patterns. I organized everything into folders by week and date. Landscaping trucks, pool contractors, roofing crews, delivery vans, pest control companies. One folder became especially useful because it showed vehicles continuing to cross after warning signs had been installed, then removed, then reinstalled, then removed again. Patterns tell stories. Around the same time, I began collecting witness statements. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary people describing what they had been told. One homeowner shared an HOA newsletter promoting the route as a community connector. Another provided meeting notes discussing neighborhood access. A contractor supplied the email instructing vendors to use the highlighted route. Every statement filled another gap. Every document explained why people believed they had permission. The residents were not creating the problem. They were following information they had received. That distinction mattered to me because I never wanted innocent homeowners blamed for decisions made at the top. By late summer, my office looked more like a legal archive than a ranch headquarters. Stacks of binders covered an entire wall. One binder held deeds. One held surveys. One held title records. Another contained inspection reports. Several contained photographs and emails. Then Erin called with something unexpected. She had submitted a records request related to communications involving access discussions. A few days later, she received a packet. Buried inside were messages showing board members questioning whether the HOA actually possessed any legal right to use the route. The questions were there in black and white. The answers were not encouraging. Somebody had raised concerns. Somebody had asked for clarification. Somebody had warned that ownership records needed to be verified. Those warnings had not stopped anything. They had been ignored. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the bridge itself was not the real goal. It was simply the cheapest solution to a much bigger problem nobody in Cedar Creek Estates wanted residents to discover. The answer to the whole mess finally showed up in a spreadsheet. Not a dramatic confession. Not a secret recording. A budget spreadsheet. Erin called me late on a Thursday afternoon and told me she had found something worth seeing in the HOA financial records that homeowners had circulated before an upcoming board election. I drove into town, met her at her office, and spent the next 2 hours reading numbers that explained more than months of arguments ever could. The problem was not access. The problem was money. Cedar Creek Estates had grown faster than expected during the previous 5 years. More homes meant more roads, more drainage maintenance, more insurance costs, and more infrastructure repairs. At first, the HOA covered those expenses using reserve funds. Then projects started piling up. Then costs started climbing. Then the reserve balance started shrinking. Nobody wanted to talk about that publicly. The numbers told the story anyway. One line item immediately caught my attention. Future West Access Improvement Project. Estimated cost, $620,417. There it was. The same number that would later make an entire hearing room go silent. According to the engineering proposal attached to the budget, Cedar Creek Estates eventually needed a dedicated access route connecting the western section of the neighborhood to the county road network. That route required land acquisition, environmental review, permitting, grading work, drainage improvements, and construction of a new crossing over the creek. Expensive. Very expensive. Suddenly, everything started making sense. If residents continued using my family's crossing, the board could delay that project for years. Maybe longer. Delay meant no special assessment. Delay meant no angry homeowners. Delay meant no election problems. Follow the money. But it got even more interesting. Buried inside another packet was correspondence involving a consulting firm hired by the HOA. The firm had evaluated future infrastructure needs and warned that relying on private property access created legal exposure. Their recommendation was simple: build a permanent solution owned by the HOA. The report was clear. The board had received it months before traffic on my property exploded. Somebody knew the risk. Somebody chose the cheaper option anyway. Then Aaron found another connection. One of the contractors repeatedly appearing in HOA planning discussions happened to be a company Miranda had worked with during her years in property marketing. Nothing illegal appeared on paper. No direct payments. No secret contracts. But the relationship was real. The same company was being discussed for future access improvements, future road planning, and several neighborhood projects. Influence has value even when money does not move directly into someone's pocket. Reputation matters. Political capital matters. Winning elections matters. Miranda was preparing for another HOA leadership vote, and keeping homeowners happy carried enormous value. A few days later, I received another unexpected call. This one came from a homeowner named Richard. He had served on a committee before resigning several months earlier. We met at a diner just outside town. He stirred his coffee for nearly a minute before saying anything. Then he leaned forward. "People think this is about convenience," he said. "It is not." I asked him what he meant. The board was terrified of a special assessment. That got my attention. Richard explained that if the HOA formally announced a $600,000 infrastructure project, many residents would immediately start asking questions about spending priorities, reserve funds, and previous budget decisions. Nobody wanted that conversation. Before an election, nobody. According to Richard, every month the neighborhood continued using my property was another month the board could postpone explaining the real financial problem. The bridge was buying them time. Suddenly Miranda's behavior looked very different. The newsletters about community access, the speeches about neighborhood connectivity, the warnings about losing a valuable route, the contractor emails, the removal of signs, the pressure campaigns. None of it happened in isolation. Every action pointed toward the same goal: preserve access long enough to avoid paying for a replacement solution. There was one problem with that strategy. My cameras kept recording. My files kept growing. My attorney kept collecting documents. And while the HOA leadership treated the issue like a public relations challenge, the evidence was quietly becoming something much more dangerous: a timeline. Because once you place financial records beside meeting minutes, contractor emails, engineering reports, and ownership documents, a pattern begins to emerge. By early fall, I no longer wondered why Miranda was fighting so hard. I knew why. The bigger question was whether she had already been warned that the plan could fail. As it turned out, that answer was sitting inside a set of emails nobody expected me to see. The email packet arrived on a Tuesday morning. Erin called before I even finished feeding the horses and told me to come by her office. Her voice sounded different. Not excited. Not angry. Focused. When a lawyer sounds focused, you pay attention. I drove into town expecting another piece of the puzzle. What I found was the corner piece that started connecting everything together. Inside the packet were communications between board members, consultants, and the HOA attorney stretching back months. Several messages discussed access concerns. Several discussed liability concerns. Several discussed ownership concerns. And one conversation stood out immediately. The HOA attorney had written a simple warning. He stated that no recorded easement appeared to authorize neighborhood use of the crossing. He recommended obtaining a legal agreement or pursuing an alternative access solution before encouraging residents to rely on the route. Clear, direct, difficult to misunderstand. Yet traffic continued increasing after that warning. That mattered. At that point, I could have tried something dramatic. I could have parked equipment near the entrance. I could have installed a gate overnight. I could have tried turning every vehicle around. Some people later asked why I did not. The answer was simple. Most of the drivers were not the problem. They were operating on information they believed was true. Punishing them would not solve anything. It would only create new problems. So I stayed with the same strategy. Build the record. Protect innocent people. Focus on the decision makers. Around that time, a school transportation contractor began using the route occasionally. Not every day, but enough for me to notice. I immediately contacted Aaron. Then we contacted the transportation company. We did not threaten anybody. We simply explained that ownership was disputed and provided copies of the survey and title findings. The company thanked us and adjusted its routing plan while the matter remained unresolved. One phone call. One problem avoided. The same thing happened with a home health care provider serving an elderly resident inside Cedar Creek Estates. One of their vehicles occasionally crossed the property. When I learned about it, I reached out directly. The driver was polite. The company was cooperative. Alternative directions were provided. No confrontation. No headlines. Just common sense. People first. Meanwhile, the engineering report continued weighing on my mind. Caleb's inspection had warned that excessive traffic accelerated wear on the structure. That did not mean the crossing was unsafe. It meant unnecessary stress was accumulating over time. Because of that, I notified my insurance carrier and supplied them with copies of the inspection report. I wanted everything documented. If something happened later, nobody could claim they had not been informed. Paper trails matter. Aaron also prepared a formal cease and desist package addressed to the HOA board. It included the certified deed records, title report findings, survey results, photographs, and excerpts from the engineering assessment. Every page served a purpose. The package did not demand money. It did not threaten residents. It simply demanded that the board stop representing the route as community access and stop encouraging continued use. Professional, measured, difficult to dismiss. We sent it by certified mail. Then we waited for the response. The board signed for the package 3 days later. We know that because certified mail creates a record. That is one lesson my father taught me years ago. Anybody can claim they never received a conversation. It is much harder to deny a signed delivery receipt. Sure enough, the receipt came back. Somebody accepted it. Somebody read it. And yet almost nothing changed. More contractor emails appeared. More vehicles crossed. More meeting discussions referenced community access. The difference was that now every action happened after documented notice. Legally speaking, that distinction can become very important. One afternoon, I ran into Richard again at the diner. He shook his head when I told him the board had received the package. Then they know exactly what they are doing, he said. I remember looking out the window toward the parking lot for a moment. The strange thing was that I was not angry anymore. Frustrated, yes. Concerned, absolutely. But anger had faded. By then the facts were doing most of the work. Every week generated new camera footage. Every week added new timestamps. Every week expanded the timeline. And while the board kept treating the situation like a public relations issue, the record was slowly becoming something much larger. It was becoming evidence of informed decisions made after repeated warnings. Then another message surfaced from the attorney file. This one included a sentence that made Erin set the paper down and stare at me across her desk. If access through private property was lost, the HOA would likely face construction costs exceeding $620,000 to establish a compliant replacement route. Suddenly, the entire battle had a number attached to it, and that number explained why nobody on the board seemed willing to back down. The county hearing was scheduled for a cold Thursday morning in late October. By then, nearly a year had passed since I first noticed vehicles using the crossing as if it belonged to the neighborhood. The room chosen for the hearing was not a courtroom. It was a county administration chamber with rows of folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and a long table at the front where officials reviewed disputes involving land use, access questions, and infrastructure concerns. Nothing about it looked dramatic. That was exactly why it mattered. Real property fights rarely happen in places that look exciting. They happen in rooms filled with paperwork. By 8:30 that morning, the seats were nearly full. Residents from Cedar Creek Estates had shown up in large numbers. Some came because they supported Miranda. Some came because they wanted answers. Some simply wanted to know whether they were about to face a massive assessment. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. Everybody knew something important was about to happen. Very few people understood what. I arrived carrying 3 binders and a hard drive. Aaron arrived carrying 2 more boxes. We did not rush. We did not make speeches. We simply checked in and took our seats. Preparation had already happened months earlier. Meanwhile, Miranda entered the room looking completely comfortable. She greeted residents. She shook hands. She smiled for photographs. Several board members sat behind her. From a distance, it looked like they expected a routine discussion rather than a major dispute. Confidence can be powerful. Sometimes it can also be misleading. The hearing began with basic introductions. Then county staff outlined the issue. Property ownership, access claims, infrastructure concerns, liability exposure, potential future impacts. The language sounded dry, but everybody in the room understood what was really being discussed. Money. Lots of money. Miranda spoke first. She presented the issue exactly the way she had presented it for months. She described the route as a long-used neighborhood connection. She emphasized community benefit. She talked about safety, convenience, and continuity. She mentioned homeowners who relied on the route. She pointed to years of use. Several residents nodded along. None of that surprised me. It was the same argument she had been making all year. Then county officials asked whether the HOA possessed any recorded ownership interest or access easement. Miranda shifted slightly in her chair. One board member began flipping through documents. Another leaned toward their attorney. The answer was not immediately available. I noticed that. So did everyone else. Small details matter. The county then called the engineering consultant responsible for reviewing infrastructure options. He displayed several maps on a large screen. One showed Cedar Creek Estates. Another showed the surrounding parcels. Another displayed potential future access routes. Residents leaned forward in their seats. For many of them, it was the first time seeing the issue laid out visually. Distances became real. Property lines became real. Costs became real. Then the consultant explained something important. If private access became unavailable, the neighborhood would eventually need a compliant replacement route. Such a project would require surveys, environmental review, grading work, drainage improvements, permits, and construction. Nobody interrupted him. The room grew noticeably quieter. A board member asked whether alternative options existed. The consultant replied that alternatives had been studied. Most were either more expensive or less practical. Again, silence. Then came a moment I had been waiting months to reach. A county official asked whether any formal warnings had ever been provided regarding ownership concerns. Erin stood up. She did not raise her voice. She simply handed over copies of certified notices, delivery confirmations, title reports, survey records, engineering findings, and correspondence logs. The official began reviewing them one by one. Several people in the audience exchanged confused looks. Some clearly had no idea such records existed. Others looked nervous, especially at the front table. Miranda still appeared confident, but something had changed. Earlier, she had been controlling the conversation. Now the documents were doing that job. Different kind of power. The hearing continued for another hour. Experts discussed inspections. Surveyors discussed boundaries. County staff discussed recorded property rights. Nobody argued loudly. Nobody needed to. Facts were slowly stacking on top of each other. By lunchtime, the atmosphere inside the room felt completely different from when the day began. Residents who arrived expecting a simple neighborhood dispute were now listening to engineers, lawyers, and county officials discuss liability, recorded ownership, and future infrastructure costs. Then the hearing officer announced a short recess before reviewing additional evidence submitted by both sides. People stood. Conversations erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Miranda gathered with board members near the front of the room. She still looked confident. But for the first time all year, I noticed something else. Concern. Because the evidence everyone had seen so far was only the foundation. The most important documents had not been shown yet. And sitting inside Erin's final binder was a collection of emails that could change the entire direction of the hearing. When the hearing resumed after lunch, the mood inside the room had changed. Earlier that morning, people were talking about convenience, neighborhood access, and community needs. Now they were talking about deeds, surveys, liability, and legal rights. Those are very different conversations. One is based on feelings. The other is based on records. The hearing officer returned to the front table and announced that additional evidence would be reviewed before any recommendations were made. That was the moment Erin opened the final binder. The first document was not dramatic. It was simply the certified deed package. Page after page showed the ownership chain stretching back decades. My grandfather, my father, then me. No transfers to the HOA. No shared ownership agreements. No recorded dedication to public use. No surprises. The hearing officer spent several minutes reviewing the documents before placing them beside the certified survey. The surveyor who prepared it was then asked to explain his findings. He walked through the measurements step by step using enlarged maps displayed on the screen. Boundary markers, parcel lines, creek locations, property corners. Then he pointed directly at the crossing. This structure is located entirely within parcel 17B, he said. There is no portion extending onto HOA property. The room became very quiet. That mattered. Next came the title report. A county official asked whether any recorded easement existed allowing Cedar Creek Estates residents to use the route. The title examiner answered clearly. No recorded easement benefiting the subdivision was identified during the title search. Then he explained something simple enough for everyone in the room to understand. Ownership and access are not the same thing. A recorded easement can allow somebody to cross property for a specific purpose. But no easement had been found here. No recorded access right. No legal authorization. Nothing. Several residents exchanged confused looks. Some appeared genuinely surprised. They had been told for months that the situation was settled. The documents suggested otherwise. Then Aaron introduced the engineering report. Photographs appeared on the screen showing structural components, support beams, inspection notes, and maintenance records. Caleb explained that the crossing remained functional but was never designed for unrestricted neighborhood traffic. More importantly, he confirmed that increased use accelerated wear and increased future maintenance costs borne entirely by the property owner. Again, nobody argued. Facts have a way of slowing a room down. Then came the camera footage. Hundreds of timestamps, vehicle logs, photographs, dates, times, deliveries, contractors, service providers. The evidence showed usage continuing long after warning signs were installed. It showed usage continuing after certified notices had been delivered. It showed usage continuing after ownership concerns had been formally raised. One board member shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another stopped taking notes altogether. The timeline was becoming difficult to explain away. But the most important evidence had not appeared yet. Aaron stood and handed several printed email chains to the hearing officer. Copies were distributed to county staff and opposing counsel. Miranda leaned forward as the first page was reviewed. Her expression changed immediately. For the first time all day, she looked uncertain. The first email came from the HOA attorney months earlier. It warned that no recorded easement had been identified. It recommended pursuing a formal agreement before encouraging residents to rely on the route. The second email repeated those concerns after additional review. The third warned about potential liability exposure if access rights were assumed without documentation. Then came another message. This one was particularly damaging. A board member had asked whether ownership records had ever been verified. The attorney responded that available documents supported private ownership and advised caution. Yet the promotional emails continued afterward. The access maps continued afterward. The contractor guidance continued afterward. The hearing officer looked up from the documents and asked a simple question. Were these recommendations followed? Nobody answered immediately. Silence filled the room. Then another email appeared on the screen. This one discussed projected costs if a replacement route eventually became necessary. The estimate exceeded $620,000. Several residents audibly reacted. A few turned toward the board table. Suddenly, the financial motive that had been hidden beneath months of messaging became visible. The issue was never simply convenience. The issue was avoiding a massive infrastructure expense. Piece by piece, the puzzle locked together. The deed established ownership. The survey established location. The title report established the absence of easement rights. The engineering report established risk. The camera footage established continued use. The emails established knowledge. Together they told a story that no speech could overcome. Miranda had spent months controlling the narrative. Now the documents were controlling it instead. The hearing officer announced that the evidence record would be closed and that county staff would prepare findings based on the materials submitted. No final consequences were announced that day. No decisions about penalties. No rulings about costs. None of that happened yet. But as people slowly stood and gathered their belongings, one thing was obvious. The question was no longer whether the crossing belonged to my family. That had been answered. The real question now was what would happen to everyone who had ignored the answer after they already knew it. The county findings were released a little over 3 weeks after the hearing, and by the time the documents became public, the story inside Cedar Creek Estates had completely changed. For nearly a year, residents had been told that access was settled, that the route was part of the community, and that anyone questioning it was creating unnecessary conflict. Now the county record said something very different. The findings confirmed that the crossing sat entirely on private property, that no recorded easement authorized neighborhood use, and that repeated warnings had been delivered long before the dispute reached the hearing stage. Facts finally had an official address. The first major consequence involved access itself. The HOA was ordered to immediately stop representing the route as community property and stop directing residents, contractors, and service providers across private land without permission. Every neighborhood access map referencing the route had to be withdrawn. Every contractor guidance document had to be updated. Every future communication had to reflect the actual property records. That happened first. Then came the financial fallout. The board commissioned an independent audit after homeowners demanded answers about how access planning had been handled and why legal warnings had not been shared openly. The audit reviewed meeting records, consultant reports, infrastructure planning decisions, and budget communications. Residents wanted transparency. They got it. Several expenses connected to the failed access strategy were identified and reclassified. Homeowners who had paid special project contributions related to preliminary route planning received credits or refunds depending on their circumstances. Nobody enjoyed writing those checks. The money had to come from somewhere. Legal costs became another major issue. After weeks of negotiations, the HOA's insurance carrier and association funds covered a substantial portion of the legal fees generated by the dispute. That outcome mattered because I had spent months documenting ownership, surveys, inspections, notices, and communications. Building a proper record is not free. Neither is ignoring one. Then came leadership changes. Miranda did not survive the next board election cycle. Several residents who once supported her publicly questioned why attorney warnings had never been shared with homeowners. Others wanted explanations regarding the access campaign and the financial exposure it created. She eventually stepped down from the presidency, and new bylaws adopted afterward prevented board members from withholding legal opinions relating to major property disputes. Trust, once lost, is difficult to recover. The infrastructure problem never disappeared either. The neighborhood still needed a long-term solution. Engineering studies moved forward, environmental reviews were scheduled, and planning began for a compliant replacement route that the HOA would actually own and control. It would take time. It would cost money, but it would also be legal. That was the difference. Meanwhile, the people I worried about most from the beginning were protected. Elderly residents, medical providers, delivery services, and families who had simply followed the information they were given were never targeted. No homeowner was accused of wrongdoing for using a route they believed was authorized. The focus remained on decisions, records, and policies, not punishment. That mattered to me. Back at the ranch, things slowly returned to normal. I repaired several sections of the structure using recommendations from the engineering report. New security cameras replaced the temporary ones. Updated lighting was installed near both approaches. A simple gate went up at the entrance, not to create conflict, but to prevent future confusion. Then came the final detail. A new sign. It was not large. It was not dramatic. It simply read, Private Bridge. Holloway Family Property. Access by permission only. Clear words. Clear ownership. Clear expectations. One afternoon several months later, I stood on the wooden planks while the creek moved beneath me exactly the way it had when I was a kid. The sunlight reflected off the water. The air smelled like cedar and damp earth. And for the first time in a long while, nobody was arguing about who owned what. Peace has value. Looking back, the thing I remember most is not the hearing, the reports, or even the six-figure infrastructure problem that started the whole fight. It is the lesson hiding underneath all of it. Papers may seem boring until the day they protect something important. Surveys seem unnecessary until someone challenges a boundary. Written notices seem excessive until people start denying conversations. This story is a dramatized narrative, but the idea behind it is very real. Property rights, records, evidence, and patience matter. The loudest voice in a dispute is not always the strongest one. Sometimes the strongest voice is a file cabinet full of documents, a timeline built carefully over time, and the decision to solve problems through lawful channels instead of anger. Standing there on that old family crossing, watching the water move past the same support beams my grandfather built decades ago, I realized that protecting what belongs to you is not really about winning. It is about making sure the truth has enough evidence to stand on its own.